The rain came down in cold, relentless sheets, turning the forest floor into a slick carpet of mud and fallen leaves. Near the edge of a dense thicket just outside Portland, Oregon, a small figure lay curled beneath the exposed roots of an old cedar tree. The fox cub was no more than 8 weeks old, his rust-colored fur matted and dark with moisture, his body trembling from exhaustion and cold. He had been alone for 2 days, maybe 3. Time blurred when hunger became the only constant. His mother hadn't returned, and his siblings were gone, scattered or lost in ways he couldn't understand. What struck anyone who might have noticed him wasn't just his fragility. It was the sound he made. A soft, rhythmic whimpering that rose and fell like a pulse, steady and heartbreaking. It wasn't a cry for help exactly. It was lonelier than that. It was the sound of a creature trying to remind himself he was still alive. Emma, a wildlife photographer returning from an early morning shoot, heard it first as she packed her gear into the back of her truck. She paused, listening through the rain, trying to place the sound. It was faint but persistent, cutting through the storm with an odd, vulnerable rhythm. She followed it into the trees, stepping carefully over slick roots and muddy ground until she found him. The cub didn't run. He didn't even lift his head. He just lay there, his small chest rising and falling in time with that soft, lonely whimper. His eyes were half open, glazed with exhaustion, and his body was so thin she could see the outline of his ribs beneath his soaked fur. Emma knelt slowly, her jacket already drenched, and reached out with careful hands. The cub flinched but didn't resist. When she lifted him, his body was alarmingly light, and the whimpering continued, quiet and rhythmic, as if it were the only thing keeping him tethered to the world. She wrapped him in a blanket from her truck and drove straight home, her mind racing through what she knew about fox rehabilitation. The cub needed warmth, hydration, and immediate care. But more than that, he needed something she couldn't name yet, something deeper than survival. The house was warm when Emma carried the fox cub inside, setting him gently on a soft towel near the heater. The whimpering hadn't stopped. It filled the quiet room like a metronome, steady and unrelenting, marking time in a way that made her chest ache. She dried him carefully, noting the sharpness of his bones, the dullness in his eyes, the way his paws twitched even in stillness. He was exhausted, but he couldn't seem to rest. The sound he made wasn't loud, but it was constant, a soft pulse of loneliness that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his throat. Emma prepared a shallow dish of water and a small amount of soft food, placing both within reach. The cub didn't move toward them. He just lay there, whimpering, his gaze unfocused. She sat beside him, speaking in low, soothing tones, hoping her presence might ease whatever fear or grief was holding him captive. But the sound continued, unbroken. Then, from the hallway, came a different sound. A slow, deliberate shuffle, accompanied by the faint click of claws on hardwood. Barnaby, her elderly beagle, appeared in the doorway. He was 12 years old, gray around the muzzle, his movements stiff with age but still purposeful. He had been her companion through years of quiet mornings and long, solitary evenings, a steady presence who seemed to understand the rhythms of her life without needing words. Barnaby paused when he saw the fox cub, his ears lifting slightly. He tilted his head, studying the small, trembling figure on the towel. Then, with the same unhurried patience he brought to everything, he walked across the room and lowered himself to the floor beside the cub. The whimpering didn't stop, but something shifted. The cub's eyes moved toward Barnaby, focusing for the first time since Emma had brought him inside. The old beagle didn't make a sound. He simply rested his chin on his paws, close enough for the cub to feel his warmth but not so close as to overwhelm him. And then, slowly, the rhythm of the cub's whimpering began to change. It softened, slowed, sinking almost imperceptibly with the steady rise and fall of Barnaby's breathing. Emma watched, barely daring to move. The cub inched closer, his small body trembling as he pressed himself against Barnaby's side. The old dog didn't flinch. He simply adjusted his position slightly, making room, offering warmth and presence without hesitation. For the first time in days, the fox cub's whimpering faded into silence. His breathing evened out, his body relaxed, and within minutes, he was asleep. Emma exhaled, feeling something tight in her chest finally loosen. The bond had formed instantly, wordlessly, between two creatures who understood what it meant to need companionship more than anything else. Over the next few days, the pattern repeated. The cub would wake, disoriented and frightened, and the whimpering would begin again, that soft, rhythmic pulse of loneliness. But Barnaby was always there. He would settle beside the cub, offering his warmth and his steady breathing, and slowly, the whimpering would fade. The cub began to eat, small amounts at first, then more as his strength returned. He started to explore the room, moving cautiously but with growing curiosity. And always, he returned to Barnaby, curling up against the old dog's side as if seeking reassurance that he wasn't alone. Emma contacted a wildlife rehabilitation specialist, explaining the cub's condition and the unusual bond that had formed. The specialist listened carefully, then offered guidance. The cub was healthy enough to survive, but he would need time to regain his strength and confidence before any decisions could be made about his future. In the meantime, Emma was advised to let the bond continue. Sometimes, the specialist explained, animals found healing in unexpected places. And this fox cub had clearly found his. As the days turned into weeks, the transformation was remarkable. The cub's fur grew thick and vibrant, his eyes bright and alert. He moved with increasing confidence, exploring every corner of the house, investigating scents and sounds with the natural curiosity of a young fox. But he never strayed far from Barnaby. The old beagle had become his anchor, his guide, his silent companion. They developed routines together. In the mornings, Barnaby would make his slow way to the backyard, and the cub would follow, bounding through the grass with playful energy while the old dog watched from the shade. In the afternoons, they would rest together in the sunlight streaming through the living room window, the cub curled against Barnaby's side, his breathing synchronized with the steady rhythm of the dog's heartbeat. Emma documented their bond, capturing photographs and videos that showed the unlikely friendship in all its quiet beauty. The images were striking. A young fox cub, wild and vibrant, nestled against an elderly beagle whose patience and gentleness seemed to transcend species. What moved her most was the way the cub looked at Barnaby. There was trust in his gaze, a deep, unshakable trust that spoke to something profound. The whimpering had stopped entirely now, replaced by soft chirps and playful yips that filled the house with life. But Emma knew the question was coming. The specialist had been clear. The cub was thriving, but he was still a wild animal. Eventually, he would need to be evaluated for release, to determine whether he could survive on his own in the wild. The thought of separating them filled Emma with a quiet dread. She had seen what the bond meant to the cub, how Barnaby's presence had pulled him back from the edge of despair. But she also knew that keeping a wild animal wasn't an option. The cub deserved a chance at the life he was meant to live, even if it meant leaving behind the companion who had saved him. The evaluation began on a crisp autumn morning when the specialist arrived with a team to assess the cub's readiness. They set up a temporary enclosure in Emma's backyard, a space designed to test the cub's natural instincts and behaviors. The cub was placed inside, and Barnaby was kept at a distance, watching from the porch with Emma. At first, the cub searched for the old dog, pacing the perimeter of the enclosure and letting out soft, questioning chirps. But when Barnaby didn't appear, the cub's instincts began to take over. He explored the space, sniffing the ground, investigating every corner. When a small toy was introduced to simulate prey, he pounced with surprising precision, his movements sharp and focused. The specialist took notes, observing his behavior with a trained eye. Over the next several days, the tests continued. The cub was exposed to natural sounds, unfamiliar scents, and simulated challenges that mimicked the wild environment he would eventually face. Each time, he adapted quickly, his instincts strong and his confidence growing. But every evening, when the tests were done, he would return to Barnaby, curling up against the old dog's side as if seeking reassurance that the bond they shared was still intact. The specialist delivered her assessment on a quiet afternoon, sitting with Emma in the living room while the cub and Barnaby rested together nearby. The cub was ready, she explained. His instincts were sharp, his health was excellent, and his ability to adapt was remarkable. He had everything he needed to survive in the wild. But there was one concern. The bond with Barnaby had given the cub something invaluable, a sense of security and companionship that had helped him heal. The question now was whether he could carry that strength with him when the bond was broken. Emma looked at the cub, his small body rising and falling in time with Barnaby's breathing, and felt her heart tighten. She knew what had to be done, but knowing didn't make it easier. The release site was chosen carefully, a protected area of forest where foxes were known to thrive. The day arrived with clear skies and a gentle breeze, the kind of day that felt both hopeful and heavy. Emma drove with the cub in a carrier beside her, Barnaby resting in the back seat. The old dog seemed to sense the significance of the journey, his gaze steady and calm. When they arrived, the specialist was already there, waiting near the edge of the forest. Emma carried the cub to the release point, Barnaby walking slowly beside her. She set the carrier down and opened the door, stepping back to give the cub space. For a long moment, the cub didn't move. He looked at Emma, then at Barnaby, his eyes searching. The old dog sat quietly, his gaze meeting the cub's with the same patient understanding he had offered from the beginning. Then, slowly, the cub stepped out of the carrier. He paused at the edge of the forest, glancing back one last time. And in that moment, Emma saw something she would never forget. The cub's posture was confident, his gaze clear. He had carried the bond with him, not as a weight, but as a foundation. Barnaby had given him more than companionship. He had given him the courage to trust, to heal, and to face the world on his own terms. The cub turned and disappeared into the trees, moving with the natural grace of a creature who had finally found his place. Emma knelt beside Barnaby, resting her hand on his graying head. The old dog watched the forest for a moment longer, then turned back toward the truck, his work complete. The lonely heartbeat of a fox cub had found its rhythm again, not through sound, but through the quiet, steady presence of an unexpected friend. And in that bond, both had discovered something profound. Sometimes healing doesn't come from words or noise. It comes from simply being there, offering warmth and patience when the world feels too vast and too cold. The fox cub returned to the wild carrying the strength Barnaby had given him. And Barnaby returned home carrying the knowledge that even in his final years, his presence had changed a life. Their friendship reminded Emma, and everyone who heard their story, that compassion knows no boundaries. That love can bridge the wildest divides. And that sometimes, the most powerful connections are the ones we never expected to find.